Welcome to the second week, Chapter 2. Last week we discussed the value of testing out some of our common sense ideas about social interaction. And this week we're going to be looking at some of the methods used in social psychology. And this will probably be a review for those of you that took 101, for those of you that have not taken 101, but you've been exposed to 102, you probably didn't go too much into the different methods of research and psychology in general, so this might be new to you. In either case, it's a good idea to read through Chapter 2 to acquaint yourself with the different methods we're going to be talking about, probably before the lecture, and definitely before the discussion, before you come up with your own idea of what type of social issue you'd like to explore, and then which type of research method you would apply to that, how you would design your study. That's the topic of the discussion for this second week. So I encourage you to do that. So we'll start out by talking about the value of social psychology research. So the world itself seems to be relatively predictable. We tend to feel like we can manage most of our situations pretty well without having to rely on science for that. But it turns out that there is some surprising evidence that maybe some of our common sense falls through the cracks when we actually apply science to them. So that's what we're going to be looking at. This is taken from your textbook on page 44, and it goes through several different research studies that have been done and asks you to guess ahead of time what the outcome was. And I encourage you to look at that. We're not going to go over them in lecture, but I encourage you to look at that. And then the actual answers to each one of these is on page 48 and 49. So check that out, because it's going to help you to understand this next term that we're going to be talking about. For now, I'd like you to consider this. See if you can predict the most successful outcomes. Say someone that you know that you're very attracted to, you would like to go out with them, but you haven't been able to ask them to go out because they've been in a relationship. Suppose that person gets dumped. When is the best time to ask them out? Is it immediately after they've gotten dumped and they're heartbroken? Or would you be more successful in getting a date if you waited and allowed them to heal before you actually ask them out? Certainly it would be more considerate to let them heal, it seems. But when they actually looked at the outcome for these types of behavior, guess what they found? You're much more likely to be successful in getting a date if you ask right away rather than waiting. So that leads us to this next concept, hindsight bias. And our authors describe it as our tendency to be overconfident about whether or not we could predict a given outcome. So a lot of times it's one of the arguments against doing science, is like, especially in social psychology, is because people say, well, why did you have to go through the expense and time to conduct a study like that? Because the results are obvious. The thing is that the results seem more obvious to us after we have the information, because we come up, when we know the outcome of a study, then our mind comes up with reasons to support why that's the logical outcome. Hindsight bias. So we're going to be talking about these different types of research, and the first one is observational research. Sometimes you might have heard it called naturalistic observation too in Psych 101. So observational research involves observing participants in social situations. It's in their natural habitat was going to be the most valid way of using observation. So in conducting observational research, you want to be as unobtrusive as possible, kind of like the fly on the wall. Or maybe you can think of like a nanny cam so that you can observe that information later. Because if you insert yourself into the situation, you can actually change the situation. The book has some examples of observational research, but one I also like to use is Jane Goodall's work with apes in Africa, and Diana Fossey's work with chimpanzees, where they went into the jungle, actually became a part of the social environment, actually didn't start noting their behavior so much until they inserted themselves into that social network and actually became an interactive, accepted individual in that group setting. And then they were able to observe and come up with some really realistic insight into how these animals behave. Another method of research is archival research, and it involves analyzing information that's already been documented. So you're looking at past records, things like newspaper, police reports, hospital records, and you can use this type of documentation to test theories about social behavior. Our textbook uses the example of archival research that Nisbin and Cohen did in 1996 when they examined the arrest and conviction records of people in the South who had committed murders, and they came up with, after gathering this data, they understood that those types of crimes tended to involve some kind of a social insult. Well, we're going to be talking about surveys next. So this also relates to what you typically hear termed as polls, and we've been hearing a lot about polls lately with some of the elections that are going on. But a survey involves asking participants either verbally or in a written form standardized questions. So it's either an interview face-to-face with standardized questions that are asked, or a standardized questionnaire that the person fills out. Oftentimes they rate something on a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 5, a Likert scale, or it's a true-false kind of questionnaire that participants respond to. So in designing surveys, it's important to consider, and also when you're reading studies about surveys, it's important to consider the number of people that were surveyed, because you want to have enough people to really represent the population, but also whether or not the survey results might be biased. So representative samples are really key to a good survey, a good predictive survey. So we'll definitely be talking about that as we go on, talking more about surveys. So if you want your participants to be representative of the population at large, you have to randomly choose them from the population in order to create a sample that's unbiased. Random sampling, simply put, means that every person in the population has an equal chance of being picked for the study. You have to be careful of what some researchers get into or fall into the trap of sampling a convenience population, a convenience sample. For example, our book talks about doing something like contacting people as they enter a library or emailing fraternity or sorority members. That's not random unless that's all you're studying are people that go to the library or people that belong to a fraternity or a sorority. Another really good example that the book talks about and I've used for years in lectures is that there was a survey in 1936 that predicted that this guy, I'm sure you haven't heard his name before, Alf Landon. They predicted that Alf Landon, who was a Republican, would defeat Franklin Roosevelt in the upcoming election. But Roosevelt ended up winning by a landslide. So people were really taken aback by that. They didn't, the pundits in that day were shocked that that could happen. So what happened here? Well, the sample that was used was not representative. So how did they design this study? Well, it was a survey, paper and pencil, and they picked their participants by using a telephone book. Back in 1936, telephones were relatively new, but we did have telephone directories that listed people's names, addresses, telephone numbers, and so they used that to send people through the U.S. mail these questionnaires, which then people could choose to fill out and send back. So that's how they gathered their data for this survey. What was the problem with that? Well, think of the time, 1936, telephones relatively new. Not every family had a telephone. Who was more likely to have a telephone and an address, a stable address that you could send something to? Probably people that had more money rather than less money. So the more affluent people were more likely to be included in this survey. And then the other thing is that more affluent people in 1936 were much more likely to be Republicans than Democrats. So they totally left out most Democrats in the survey. So it wasn't representative and therefore was not predictive of what would happen in the general election. This visual was taken from your book, and it explains more about, compares random sampling to convenience sampling, and definitely in that 1936 survey, that sample is a really good example of what a convenience sample is. So random samples are, on the other hand, are much more likely to capture what's going on within the population at large. In other words, they're going to represent, be a good sample to represent what's going on in the general population. There have been many, many studies in social psychology and psychology in general that have used U.S. college students because they're kind of a captive audience at universities. And although there has been some debate about how representative that is, how you can apply that information to the population as a whole, we know that at least to that age group and to that demographic that we can apply our knowledge. So here's an example of one survey taken from your book, and this is actually, I'm sure, not the whole survey, but it's just more like an example of some of the items that Nisbet and Cohen included in their survey to see what people's attitudes were towards violence. And it resulted in them finding that Southerners tend to be more violent towards situations where there is an insult and also are more likely to spank their children. I'm going to stop at that point and we'll talk about correlational research next.